Hello, and welcome back to Morganza and part two of my conversation with famed Beatles historian David Bedford from Liverpool. We had a blast in part one, so you should definitely check that out if you haven't. But at the end of part one, David was talking about the Beatles playing at the opening of the Casbah Club when they still weren't even really a rock and roll group yet. And that's where we pick things up today.
Yeah, because they started out as a skiffle group. We don't know what that is in this country.
Yeah.
But so how would you describe it? I mean, part of it is homemade instruments, right? You had the tea-chest bass, which basically means a box with a neck and a piece of string on it.
Yeah,
Right?
it's a tea chest.
Yeah.
It's a wooden packing case that we imported tea leaves in.
Okay.
Once that was empty, you bought that, painted it up, painted a logo and stuff on it. Then you got a broom handle. And you tie string to the top of the broom handle,
Right.
and the other end of the string goes in the top of the middle of the box, which you've turned upside down. When you pull it tight and go twang, it makes a sound in there.
And it resonates in the box.
So the closest thing is, if you know of jug bands, or think of Creedence Clearwater Revival, Willie and the Poor Boys.
Right.
Look at the album cover.
Right.
They're playing Skiffle.
That's
so Skiffle it's got its roots in American folk, a little bit bluegrass country. Yeah.
Jug band.
Yeah, exactly. And so you've got all these kids in Britain, and there were thousands of these groups everywhere. And Lonnie Donegan is the guy who started it all off. Who was
so we don't really know him much either.
No, because you won't, unfortunately. But George Harrison said, "No Lonnie Donegan, no Beatles." And he's absolutely right, because
no, a lot of groups.
Well, because if you look at the bands that come through in the 60s, most of them start in Skiffle.
Right.
Donegan was introducing this music, and you got kids in the middle of England singing railroad songs from America. They don't understand what the hell they're singing about. But it didn't matter. Yeah, it didn't matter, because what Donegan was saying was, here's all this great music, but you only need to learn 3 chords.
Right.
And if you know 3 chords, you can play all these songs. You don't have to know how to read and write music. That didn't matter. Up until that point, the only way to play music professionally was to learn to read and write and learn a proper instrument. And he was saying, you don't need to do that. So in the jazz band that he was in, the Chris Barber jazz band, they were playing Dixieland jazz. But you can only play that for about 40, 45 minutes. And the lips go numb, or their head's about to explode for blowing instruments. But so they wouldn't lose the audience, Donegan swapped his banjo for a guitar. Chris Barber swaps his trombone for a tea-chest bass. And Beryl Bryden, the singer, would get a washboard and some thimbles. They came forward, and for about 15 minutes would sing some of these songs which became known as Skiffle songs. That became so popular, that became part of their act. And then when they're making a jazz album as the Chris Barber Jazz Band, they were short for a couple of songs. So he said, let's put on a couple of the Skiffle songs, Rock Island Line and John Henry. And so each of the songs is released as a single. January 56, Rock Island Line gets in the top 10 here, and the Skiffle craze starts. And that's what gets John, Paul and George all picking up guitars. And people like Jimmy Page, with these great guitarists who come through, the guys from the Stones, they were all inspired by Lonnie Donegan and Skiffle. But what they soon learned was, if you knew those 3 chords and maybe you found out a 4th chord and got really excited, those chords played rock and roll.
Right.
And so Skiffle lasts a couple of years at most. By the beginning of 59,
because rock and roll's happening
rock and roll.
At the same time.
Because you think of 1956, it's the year everything changes.
Elvis.
And it's Little Richard. See, Little Richard was huge over here and not so big in the States.
In England.
So for John Lennon, it's Lonnie Donegan, early 56. April 56, he hears Long Tall Sally for the first time. And he said, when I first heard that, it was so great I couldn't speak. So that was the music that really inspired him. And then Heartbreak Hotel comes out. all in 1956. So within weeks of all that happening, Lennon starts the Quarrymen.
Right.
In the summer of 56. And
Right.
that was it. And the Quarrymen aren't a separate group to the Beatles. The Quarrymen eventually evolve into the Beatles.
Right.
Because Paul joins in July 57. And then December 57, George joins. So they're still the Quarrymen.
Right.
Right through 58, right through 59. And it's only when you get into 60 that they then say, right, we're done with the Quarrymen name and we're going to be a rock and roll group. And that's when the Beatles. Then, so it's all this evolution. And that's what I tried to show is how the group evolved into the Fab Four.
Right. Right. Yep. And there are lots of permutations on that name, going from the Quarrymen to the Beatles. There were Beatles with a double E. There were Silver Beatles. There were lots of variations on that name.
Yeah.
So who
they're just trying to find something.
Who do you give the credit for Beatles with an A?
Right. So Beatles initially goes for Stuart. So it's a conversation between Stuart Sutcliffe and John. And John picked up on it because John loved to play with words.
Right.
He said he liked things that meant two different things. So obviously the hero were Buddy Holly and the Crickets. And for us Brits, crickets can be an insect or a game.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah. So that's how they were thinking. So then we got crickets to Beatles. So we're still insects. But it's insects, but they're playing beat music. So that's got two things.
Right.
So the first spelling is actually Beatals. Beatals.
The first spelling was?
The first spelling was Beatals.
Oh.
And then when they get their first drummer, Tommy Moore, and Stuart Sutcliffe, is joining them as bass player, they need a name. And at that time, everybody was known as something and the somethings, like Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, Jerry and the Pacemakers, Cass and the Casanovas. It was all like that.
Right.
And so everybody said, what you call yourselves, the Beatles? That's a stupid name. You can't do it. You're the leader, John. It should be John and the Beatles. And somebody was saying, like, hang on, you could be like Long John Silver and the Beatles. And he got to Long John and the Silver Beatles. And he thought, no. Right. And John never wanted to have his name out there. It was always about being a group. So again, that they were quite different from the start. It was not about him. He didn't have an ego for that at all, which he could well have done. It was always his group. But he said no. So they sort of agreed to be Silver Beatles. That did not last very long at all. And very quickly, they go off to Scotland with Johnny Gentle for a couple of weeks, which was quite an experience.
That was one of my favorite chapters in the book.
It's a fabulous story, isn't it?
It really is. It was a short tour. It's like a week or two, right? And they were broke all the time.
Yep.
They had a drummer that they just picked up, right? They had a car wreck.
Yep.
The drummer was badly hurt in the car wreck.
Yep.
And John kind of talked him into, kind of forced him into continuing to play.
I think the proper way of saying it is John went to the hospital and dragged him out of his hospital bed. And poor Tommy Moore, bless him, he was a brilliant drummer.
Yeah.
But because they'd had the crash, one of the guitar cases flew forward and smashed him in the face. So it broke his nose. He lost some teeth, split his lip.
Oh my gosh.
And of course, if you're in hospital with concussion and a banging headache, what instrument do you not want to play? It's the drums. But they needed them because they were playing that night. So poor Tommy's dragged out of hospital, stuck behind the kit, and he said John would turn around and try and make him laugh. Because if he laughed, maybe his stitches would burst.
Cruel.
Yeah, and then they get back to Liverpool, and John's stunned when Tommy Moore quits.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah.
But like every day, he was on the phone. Who booked it for him? Was it Alan Williams or?
Yeah, so Alan was acting as their agent and first manager.
Right. And he was like calling him every day saying, Where's the money? Where's the money?
Yeah.
They were like dirt broke.
Yeah, they've given it a ridiculous amount of money. You couldn't possibly survive on that.
I know.
Because they had to feed
Right.
themselves. They were staying in these crummy little bed and breakfast places. But I think when they look back on it, that taught them a hell of a lot. Because, within 2 weeks of becoming a rock and roll group, the first day they plays rock and roll group as the Silver Beatles is the first day they meet their drummer, Tommy. So 2 weeks later, they're on tour together. They haven't really perfected how they're playing. Tommy's learning to play with the others. Stuart Sutcliffe had not long started learning bass.
Right.
They got no experience of doing anything, but within those 2 weeks on stage, they learned so much.
Yeah.
And I think that they learned more than they probably realized at the time of how to be a group.
So they were a backing group, basically, for Johnny Gentle, right?
Yeah.
Who was, another name that we don't know anything about here. But,
well, he didn't do that much over here. Larry Parnes was the promoter. And Larry Parnes took these individual singers, gave them a stage name. So you had Marty Wilde and Billy Fury, Duffy Power, Vince Eager. And of course, John Askew, being a ballad singer, became Johnny Gentle.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the role that they were, a backing group for Johnny Gentle. And they'd not rehearsed with him. They met him in Scotland.
Right.
And he's saying, right, do you know these songs? No. Well, this is what you've got to do. So it was a learning experience, but within those 2 weeks, Johnny could see the difference. And because they'd have a spot of their own, of doing their own songs as well, by the end of the tour, they were getting bigger cheers than Johnny Gentle was.
Yeah. So that's kind of the start. Because before that, a lot of people in your book, they said they were terrible. They were kind of awful.
Yeah,
like most of the bands starting out probably were, right?
Exactly. And I think it's fair enough to say that, because if you don't start off being terrible, it's not real. It's not real. Come on, somebody's making something up. They were not great. And it's not till they get to Hamburg when they're forced to play for hours and hours on stage. That's when they learn to become great musicians and become a great group.
Right.
But they'd only been together for 3 months when they went to Hamburg.
Yeah.
So,
and they went with Pete Best the first time, right?
Yeah.
And they kind of grabbed him on their way out the door, right? It was like he was a last minute addition to the group.
Yeah, so after Tommy Moore had quit, they then get another drummer, Norman Chapman, who was a really good drummer. He should have gone to Hamburg with them. A week before they're going to Hamburg, Norman Chapman gets called up to join the army, do his national service.
Right.
So suddenly they're stuck, and they're being paid as a 5-piece, which is the 3 guitars, bass, and drums. They need a drummer. And so they think, who do we know? Hang on, we know Pete Best up at the Casbah, because they played there for so long. And it's Paul rang Mona, said, look, we're going off to Hamburg. Could Pete come? And she said, well, if it's okay with him, it's fine with me. So that was on the Friday. Pete gets invited down for an audition on the Saturday, an audition of 1. He was the shortlist.
Right.
And Alan Williams said afterwards, we called it an audition just so he wouldn't ask for too much money.
Yeah, that's right. That's a good story.
And I met Alan many times. Got some great stories of Alan. So then they get together at the Jacaranda on the Sunday. And they think, well,
that's Alan's club.
That's Alan's club. Let's run through as many songs as we know. And that sort of rehearsal ends up with a little audience. Now, in the basement of the Jacaranda, you'd only get 20, 25 people in. Maybe 30 had a squeeze. They didn't have 30. But that becomes their first sort of performance as the Beatles down there in the basement of the Jack, which is a rehearsal. And then Monday, they're getting ready. Monday night, they head off to Hamburg. So it all happened so quickly.
Yeah. And so getting to Hamburg is, so first of all, they're driving in some cramped old van, right?
Yeah.
And they get it. So you're driving to the coast. The van gets put on a ferry
Yep.
with a crane or something, right?
Yep.
And then sails across to Holland.
Yep. Hook all.
And then drives up to Hamburg.
Yeah.
It was a bit awful.
Yeah, because those vans were not made to go probably above 50 miles an hour. And there's 10 people in there, plus all the gear is on the roof. So they'd be chugging along and going very slowly, very uncomfortable.
So if we could go back a little bit,
Yeah.
There was like back in the 30s in the UK. All right, so you talk about this in 104. There was a period where there were a lot of musicians who played at the movies.
Yeah.
So you had silent movies, and there were a lot of musicians that played during the movies.
Yeah.
And when the talkies came along, those guys were all out of work. And so there were a lot of musicians kind of roaming the streets at that time. And the UK reacted by banning American jazz musicians from playing in the country, right?
Yep.
Which is an astonishing kind of thing.
Because that was the popular music.
Yeah. Well, it led to the demise of jazz, right? Because it only applied to jazz.
Yeah.
And so it didn't apply to blues or gospel or, rock or pop or skiffle. So that kind of opened the door too for these kinds of developments that were happening.
Yeah, no, it was a big thing. So a lot of the biggest clubs like the Cavern were jazz clubs.
There was a jazz club. And in fact, one thing I love about the Cavern Club, you weren't allowed to wear blue jeans.
Oh, no.
The thinking being that if you were dressed in your good clothes, you were less likely to, cause trouble and tear things up.
Well, the jeans were for working class workers. Couldn't have that. You had a shirt and a tie, please. Thank you.
That's funny. And there was no alcohol in these clubs, right?
That's correct. Yeah. Tea, coffee, Coca-Cola.
These are teen clubs, right?
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so that kind of set the stage for those kind of popular music developments. So how did Liverpudlians? How did they? That's the word, right? Liverpudlians.
Yep.
How did you hear American music in those days?
Yeah.
So
not very easily.
TV and radio are both controlled by the Crown, right?
Yeah, the BBC.
Yeah, by the BBC. And so there are these Beatles fans have been told for a long time that it was the merchant seamen bringing records back from the U.S. and that was one way that that you would hear American music there.
Yeah, so that was one of the ways.
That's part of the story, though.
Yeah, it's been sort of grown into this huge,
right.
As many things get mythologized in Beatles history,
right.
But it was a thing. Virtually anybody who was in a group, at least one member would have a relative on the ships. And the first transatlantic regular sailings were between Liverpool and New York. That was back in 1840. So that was the established run. So like John's dad was the Merchant Navy. George's dad had been Merchant Navy in the 30s as well. So it was a regular thing. And they'd sail to New York. They'd have 2 or 3 days off. And everybody went. And it wasn't just records. They got suits, they got cameras, they got cologne, they got cigars. And some of them would try and affect a bit of an American accent when they came back, dressed in their zoot suits and everything. They became known as the Cunard Yanks.
The Cunard Yanks.
Cunard Yanks.
Cunard was the shipping line.
Yeah.
Right.
That was the main line that had started back in 1840. So they're the Cunard Yanks. But yes, they brought records. And it wasn't just rock and roll. It was jazz, but it was country. Country music was massive in Liverpool.
Yeah, you did a book about that too, right? I want to get to that one because that interests me.
Yeah. So all this American influence. So all the records were coming in. But radio was the thing. Because if you didn't have the pocket money to go and buy the records, you listened on radio, but you couldn't listen to the BBC, which had a national monopoly.
Right.
They had Skiffle Club on a Saturday, so they would play some skiffle. That was okay because it was an offshoot of jazz. Rock and roll, not a chance. So you had to tune in to Radio Luxembourg. So Luxembourg is this little principality in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
And in the 30s, that started beaming in radio shows. That was then taken over by the Nazis during the war for propaganda broadcasting.
Right.
And then was returned to normal broadcasting. And they had the radio shows, and each record label had their own DJ. And they had some of the big American ones, like Alan Freed.
Yeah.
He had a show on Radio Luxembourg.
That's amazing.
And so you had to tune in. And with it being on shortwave radio, you're spending ages tuning the dial, trying to get it. And the signal was stronger at night.
Mm-hmm.
So it was required listening for the lads everywhere. Sunday night chart show. And you listened and picked up what you could and then talked about it in school. Now, the other thing was AFN, the Armed Forces Network.
Oh.
Because you still had other US troops all around Europe. So the specific shows made for the American troops abroad. And that was beamed in on AFN. So again, on shortwave radio, you could tune in and listen to that. So one of John's school friends, Don Beatty, had tuned into AFN. That's when he first heard about Elvis. I went in and told John, I just listened to this guy, Elvis Presley.
Oh.
Wow.
So John's Uncle George, Mimi's husband, had wired a speaker into his bedroom.
Right. I read about that.
Yeah, and Jim McCartney did the same thing for Paul.
So they could listen at night.
So they could listen in, and George could listen on the family one there. So that was the thing, was to listen into the radio show and hope the song you were interested in got played.
Right. But there's also a U.S. base, a military base outside Liverpool, right?
Yeah, Burton Wood.
Mm-hmm. So that had some influence too, I would think.
Well, a big influence because that was taken over by the US Air Force in 42, became the biggest operational air base in Europe during the war.
Mm-hmm.
And they had, I swear, around 19,000, whatever, US servicemen based there. So when the planes were coming over on the ships, they'd come in and were taken on wagons through Liverpool out to Burton Wood. They were then assembled there and flown down to the southeast of the country.
Right.
So it was a huge base, but because there was still segregation back in the US at the time, the air base was segregated because it was considered American soil. There was still a presence there until somewhere, I think the last went up at the end of the 1980s, was that the last Americans left there. So it was still a big Operation Air Base.
Wow.
But in late 50s, early 60s, there were still thousands there. And because of the segregation, in Liverpool, we've got the oldest black communities established here in Britain were established in Liverpool because of being a port. And so in the Liverpool 8 area, the Dingle is part of the Liverpool 8 area. There were all these black clubs. There was over 20 of them. Each different country had their own club, but they weren't just frequented by the black population. It was a mixed audience. Right. And so John and Paul were introduced to these clubs and local black musicians by Lord Woodbine, who was Alan Williams' business partner. He was the first singer-songwriter that John and Paul met. Woody then became really instrumental in introducing them to the black musicians who taught John and Paul a lot of guitar technique. But while they're in some of those clubs, they're then interacting with the black Americans from Burton Wood Air Base who were coming into Liverpool. Some of them were great musicians, bring their instruments with them, or bringing their records with them. So John and Paul are then talking to these American guys and listening to songs which were not available in Britain yet. So American music was finding its way into Liverpool in so many different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why Liverpool was so unique. Why I've always said that the Beatles could only have come from Liverpool.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very, very unique place.
Yeah, I remember reading about Lord Woodbine in your book. That was quite a story.
Oh, he's a great character. Great character.
Yeah.
And been written out of a lot of history books.
Yeah. And so you orchestrated a reunion of, was it with him and somebody who had
Oh, that was with Fitzroy Jimmy James. He was in
Okay.
Woody's group, the Royal Caribbean Steel Band.
okay, you're right.
Right.
And he played in the Jacaranda basement. Because John and Paul were obsessed with the steel pans. They were playing Calypso 6 nights a week.
Yeah.
And they all became, good friends.
Mhm.
And Jimmy had tracked me down because he'd seen that I'd met Alan and I interviewed him and stuff. And we became really good friends. And so I arranged then for when Jimmy, because he lived in out in the Bronx, in New York for many, many years. Sadly, he's passed now. But he was coming to Liverpool. So I got in touch with Alan and reconnected the two of them.
Wow.
And that was a lovely time, the two of them getting together and just reminiscing. It was fabulous.
That's great. Good. So why was it so hard to find a drummer? Is it because the drum kits are so expensive, or because everybody wants to play guitar because it's more glamorous?
It's a mixture of both.
Yeah.
It's a mixture of both. So the Quarrymen were very unusual because they had a drummer. Colin Hanton, who still is the drummer with the Quarrymen, was a couple of years older than John. And he was affected by the Skiffle craze. But because he was 18 when Skiffle kicked off, he was already working at that point. He just fancied playing the drums and he could afford to go and get some.
Mhm.
So the Quarrymen were unusual because they had a drummer. Most groups didn't. And they relied on the washboard and the T-chest bass to provide the rhythm.
So they were all set to become a rock and roll band because they had a drummer already.
It all helps.
That's nice.
All helps. Yeah.
All
So
helps.
drummers were hard to come by because it was the most expensive piece of equipment. And Skiffle was acoustic.
Right.
You see, so you didn't need to spend a lot of money on a guitar.
Right.
Washboard your mum had for doing the washing. The T-chest and a broom handle cost you a couple of shillings. So next to nothing. But drums, very expensive.
Very expensive. Yep. What about bass players? So they're also hard to come by. Is that just, in fact, you tell one story. There were two guys, I forget their names, who were trying to get, who wanted to be the bass player. And one said, well, I'll make a bass. And the other could afford to buy one. So he won.
Well, funnily enough, so the two guys were Rod Murray and Stuart Sutcliffe.
It was Stuart.
Yeah, and the two of them shared a flat. And in fact, I was talking to Rod Murray yesterday. I'm going to see him next week. Still in touch with him. So Stuart and Rod were sharing a flat. And John, Paul and George came round and said, look, we're going to start a rock and roll group. We need a bass player. Whichever one of you can get a bass can join the group. Whoever they'd offered that position to before, I'd always said, can't afford it. Because it's not acoustic. It had to be electric and it's expensive.
Right.
So because Rod and Stuart were at the art college, Rod was into design. So he designed his own bass guitar.
I see, because he was at the art college.
And the photo I took of Rod Murray with that is he cut out the template for his bass guitar to make his own guitar.
Yeah.
And he was a great designer. Went on to have a very good career in design. But Stuart, being a brilliant painter, exhibited one of his paintings in a local art competition. Now, he didn't win it, but John Moores, who was the millionaire who sponsored it, saw the painting, liked it, and he bought it for £65. Now, that was a hell of a lot of money. Back in the early 1960. That's a lot of money. So once John and Paul found out Stuart was getting £65, they thought, right, you're buying a bass guitar. And up at the Casbah Club, so it crops up again, they pinned him into the corner until he agreed to buy a bass guitar because it was expensive.
Yeah.
And so that's how Stuart becomes a bass player.
we've been told over the years that he played with his back to the audience. Stuart did, because he couldn't really play bass, and he didn't want anybody to see how bad he was. Is there any truth to that story?
For the first couple of weeks, yes.
First couple of weeks, yeah. Well, I'd be the same way the first couple of weeks. I think.
Absolutely right. Anybody would. So it's all been, again, mythologized, like so many of these things are.
Right.
Where on that first day, the rock and roll group, as the Silver Beatles, there's photos taken. And one of the people I interviewed was the photographer, Cheniston Rowlands, who took those photos. Wow. And Stuart was told, like, stand side on so they can't see what you're playing. And that's how they got through initially. But Stuart became a really good rock and roll bass player.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I've spoken, as well as Pete Best, of course, they were the rhythm section, Pete and Stuart. So Pete played regularly with Stu for hundreds of hours. And other musicians who played with Stuart have said, yeah, he's a really good bass player. Had no problem.
Nice.
Klaus Voormann, of course, goes on to become a professional bass player. When he's in Manfred Mann over here in the Plastic Ono band, playing with all the guys. He was inspired to play bass by Stuart.
Yeah.
And Klaus, actually, once he knew Stuart was going to step down because he wants to concentrate on his art, Klaus asked if he could be the bass player. But he'd already decided that Paul was going to take the role.
He was just a little too late.
Yeah, so he just missed that one. But no, again, it becomes all part of this trying to protect, for some reason, protect the Fab Four as being these exemplary musicians. None of the four of them were the best in Liverpool at their instrument.
Right.
So how do they do it? Because together, nobody could touch them.
Right.
And it wasn't just the instruments, it was the voices. You talk about, harmony. You think of people like the Everly Brothers. It's normally, it's family. There's something within family making harmonies which comes naturally, which if you're not related is harder. Beach Boys were the same. But somehow John, Paul and George, not being related, those three voices together got perfect harmony. So then you have great musicians, so not the top ones, but great musicians, fantastic voices. And then the development of the songwriting. It's the perfect storm. And it's the whole idea of, the sum of the parts is greater than the individuals, which is why, in a way, they all sort of struggled as solo artists.
Mm-hmm.
Because there was that something special with the four of them.
Right.
That just made the magic happen. Then adding George Martin into the mix as the fifth Beatle.
Right.
No, it's magic.
That's all for this time. Be sure to join us for the third and final part of my conversation with David Bedford, coming soon. And in the meantime, you can check out David's website, davidabedford.com, and BeatlesBookstore.com. And you can follow David on X at @LilyPoolDave. Be sure to give us a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button. And thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time on Morganza.